It to the 16th chapter of Luke, which, as you know, last week we finished up the 15th chapter, and we're looking at Luke 16 this morning. And if you have a New International Version of the Bible, you might notice that they have a little title over Luke 16, and it says, "The Parable of the Shrewd Manager." On the other hand, if you are looking at a New Revised Standard Version, the title says, "The Parable of the Dishonest Manager." Or if you're looking at the Message this morning, the title is "The Story of the Crooked Manager." And that may be sort of the first indication to you that there's not a lot of agreement on this parable about whether this guy is just shrewd, kind of a clever guy, or he's just a little dishonest and a little bit, or this is just a crooked manager, and he's a bad guy. And in fact, if that's your indication this morning, that's my indication from studying this. And in fact, many people have looked at Luke 16 and arrived at the conclusion that this is difficult. For example, Robert Stein says, "Few passages of Scripture have caused as much confusion as the opening parable of Luke 16. Or, Walter Liefeld says, "The interpretation of this parable in Luke 16 is notoriously difficult." Richard Foster in Money, Sex, and Power says, "The opening verses of chapter 16 of Luke, Jesus tells a parable that has tied commentators into knots and puzzled ordinary Christians for centuries." As well it should, he continues, for the story is indeed an unusual one. Darrell Bock is pretty succinct. He says, "This story is probably the most difficult parable in Luke." So I'm going to ask you to work with me this morning. I'm going to do the best I can, but I'm going to need you to do the best you can just to track where we are going, to not get ahead, not get behind. And I have to tell you, I was at a party last night, which may not be the best thing to do before you preach on a Sunday morning, but it was a Christian gathering, and I was at this party, and it was in honor of a friend of mine, so I wanted to be there. And while I was there, I was introduced to a gentleman, and I was introduced that he was a Master of Arts in the New Testament. He was getting his degree, and in fact, the focus of his thesis in the New Testament was on the Gospel of Luke. And in fact, I asked, "Well, what about Luke?" And he said, "Well, I'm looking at themes of stewardship in the parables of Luke." So this gentleman is an expert focusing exactly on this. And Gary Wilkins, who was there, said, "David's going to preach on Luke 16 tomorrow." And he said, "That's really a hard one." In fact, I don't even know what that means. What do you think that means? And this was last night at 8:30. I mean, this is way too late to be having this kind of discussion on what this parable means. So, and even Bruce this morning said, "Were you preaching to that guy last night?" No, I was asking him last night what he thought this meant. So, anyway, let's read this parable and see what we can do with it this morning. 16 verse 1. Jesus told his disciples, "There was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and asked him, 'What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management, because you cannot be manager any longer.' The manager said to himself, 'What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I know what I'll do, so that when I lose my job here, people will still welcome me into their houses.' So he called in each one of his master's debtors. He asked the first, 'How much do you owe my master?' 800 gallons of olive oil,' he replied. The manager told him, 'Take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Then he asked the second, 'And how much do you owe?' 1,000 bushels of wheat,' he replied. He told him, 'Take your bill and make it 800. The master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings.'" Let's stop there. We'll go on a few more verses, but let's stop and digest this parable to begin with. Before we even look at the parable, I think there's a couple foundational truths that we need to talk about just to bridge the gap between this first century parable and where we are today, because this is somewhat an unfamiliar territory we're going through. And then my plan is actually to analyze the parable itself, and then Jesus gives us commentary on the parable, and it's really Jesus' commentary that we really want to focus on at the end, and then applying it to our lives and our current situation and say, well, what does this mean to me? And in fact, that's the first bridge that we need to cross. First of all, this is a very uncommon concept. A manager, a steward, someone who would be in charge of all that you have, but it's not you. I mean, I might loan my car to somebody, or I might be on vacation and let somebody house sit and stay in my house, but I don't expect them to, come back and have them change the furniture around or sell the furniture. Or come back and say, well, I didn't sell it. I got rid of some of the worst stuff. I mean, who wants that anyway? We're not used to having somebody who would actually be in charge of your stuff while you're not there. So we have to kind of put ourselves in the first century where things took a long time. Things took a long time to do. If you were just going to make a meal in the first century, it's not microwave. It's not turn on the gas. It's not electricity. It's get the stone, get the corn. Grind the corn with the stone till it's a meal, not even flour, just do a meal. Mix it with some oil, mix it with some before you get the water, go to the well. It's a long way. Carry back all the water you can carry, which is what you're going to cook with and what you're going to clean up with and shower with and keep the kids clean with. You might take 2 trips to the well. So it takes a long time just to have one cake made out of corn meal. So much that if you were a person of means, you wouldn't want to take a lot of time to do that. You might just get a slave whose job it was to cook, get water from the well, and to grind grain and things for you. But where does the grain come from? Well, that comes from the field. And if I were to give you a hoe this morning and ask you to hoe, there's only so many acres you could hoe yourself before the sun went down tonight, or you went down before the sun. And so you might just get a slave to work this many acres. And if you had 100 acres, it might take 10 or 12 slaves just to run the field, to get the grain, to get the meal going. Okay? Well, you say, well, maybe we'll get a donkey or an ox. Well, donkeys and oxes take a lot of work. You might have somebody in the stable. Pretty soon you can have people in the stable, people in the field. You might need more than one cook now if you're trying to maintain a whole household. So you might have 2 or 3 cooks going. It's a big thing just to keep everybody fed in your household, to manage your fields and trees and animals and so forth. So if you're really a person of wealth, you say, I don't even want to do that. I just want somebody to be in charge of everything so that I can just go to Jerusalem and hang out with my rich friends, or I can travel, or I can just... It's hard to be a person of leisure in the first century. So this is a common concept in Galilee. We have archaeological evidence of large estates, and it just took a lot of people. Even in the Bible, we know of Abraham, who had 318 men in his household. It was a very large operation just to run his household. Or we know about Joseph in the Old Testament, who was put in charge of all of Potiphar's house. And we know that Potiphar was only concerned with the food that he ate. Okay? So there is this position in the first century. It's kind of gone away here. We don't have this kind of job anymore. But the people that Jesus was talking to would have understood this. Oh, yes, I know some people like that. I know some people who are stewards or house managers who are in charge of other slaves who keep households running. But there's something else we need to know about, and that's the first foundational truth. This is the second foundational truth, is we need to look at where this parable resides in the Gospel of Luke. This is actually the 4th parable in the series we have been covering. We started with the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son, and Jesus does not move his venue. This is the 4th parable told to the same audience. So we need to understand it in its context of those other parables. And in fact, what we find is that we had a prodigal son who was wasting his father's possessions, and here we have a steward who is also wasting his master's possessions. And in fact, it's the exact same word in Greek. It's intended to be linked together. Okay, there's a couple other things that, the prodigal son, his main concern was, how do I get received home to my father? The reception home is a major part of that parable. And we'll find that the manager is very concerned, how am I going to be received into people's houses? Who's going to have me once I've lost my job? So this parable is told to the same audience. The change is, in verse 1, it says that Jesus told his disciples. If you remember, and if you've been here a few weeks, Jesus was talking to tax collectors and open sinners, and he was being observed by Pharisees who were muttering to themselves, and we'll find those Pharisees come back here at the end of this parable. They are muttering to themselves, so he told a parable to the tax collectors and sinners, a parable in the oldest son to the Pharisees, and then he turns to his disciples and says, here's another parable. Here's one you guys sort of on the inside need to know about. Now, why would he want to tell them this parable? Let's just think about this. Imagine yourself being a Galilean fisherman, a little bit poor. You've traveled with Jesus a couple years now. You've given up a lot just to be with him. You know he's on the way to Jerusalem. You think bad things are going to happen to him. And all he talks to you about is the cost of discipleship. All he tells you is you got to hate your father and mother if you want to follow me. He tells you you got to give up everything. You got to pick up your cross daily and follow me. And then you find yourself at table with these tax collectors who are wealthy, who have serious cash flow going, who are enjoying their lives, and he's telling them about the prodigal son. God is waiting for you guys. God is God is seeking you like a coin or a sheep. Well, if you're a disciple, you're going, wait a minute, I'm in the wrong plan here. I'd like the rich now, welcomed later plan. I'd like to have it all and have something to squander, please, and then get welcomed in at the end, if you will. I mean, why don't I just put this off until I'm ready to die anyway, and then I'll go to Jerusalem? Okay? This parable is to talk to the disciples saying, don't envy this prodigal son. Okay? There's something more about this. And also, maybe you're a disciple going, I am pious, and I did give up everything, and these people are going to give up everything too, it would seem. But I think Jesus is saying, no, don't look at these people who are squandering this life, as it were. They're wasting everything. Don't look down on them, because in fact, you guys are wasting stuff too. Okay? You guys are squandering possessions, and we'll get to that. I have something to say to you in this parable. So don't envy them. Don't look down on them. In other words, this parable is going to tell us there are consequences to what the prodigal son did. He was received home, but I'm not sure the father was delighted about the way he made his world tour, as it were. And I don't think God is delighted about us saying, I'm going to take the squander it now and get saved just before I die plan. Okay, there are consequences to our choices, and there are rewards for our choices in this life. So are you with me? You got that? Those are our two foundation truths. One is the concept of a steward that is in charge of everything and even has the power to dispose of possessions or to buy or sell or things like that so that the wealthy person can go on their own. And then the context of this in relationship to the other three parables that we've just read. So with that, let's look at the first couple verses. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager or steward was accused of wasting his possessions. So he called him in and said, what is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot be manager any longer. Now, he was accused of wasting. Now, this word wasting, and this is true of the prodigal son as well, does not necessarily have a moral component to it. Now, in the case of the prodigal son, it's probably not a bad assumption that a single guy on his own in a foreign country was making some morally bad choices. But this word does not require that. And I think Jesus is leaving the door open that this manager or the prodigal son could have just put it all in the NASDAQ, okay, last year. And they thought Pet.com was going to be the winner, or Go.com, or TheGlobe.com, and it just went down from 99, and it's now trading for 75 cents, and it's all gone. Okay, it was just a reckless loss. It could have been a morally reckless loss, but it doesn't have to be. So don't just read this morning, don't hear this morning that, well, I'm not sinning with my money, therefore this doesn't apply to me, because Jesus is speaking very broadly here. He says he's wasted his possessions. He's asked, what does this mean? And as he stands accused, we find three important things about stewardship as a concept. Number one, we find that stewardship has an end point. Okay, this is not your stuff. This is my stuff. There's going to be a time when I want my stuff back. Okay, there's a specific time period we're talking about. Second of all, stewardship implies an accounting. At the end of it, I want you to give account for my stuff and what you did with my stuff. And third, there is an expectation. there's an expectation that's entailed with this, that I want my stuff back and I want it better. I have expectations of how you've used my stuff. It's the same way as if you loaned your car to me, I'd say, I need a car for a week. Is that okay? You have an extra car. You would have an expectation that I would not cut the top off it and make it a convertible. I could do it. I could make it actually look pretty good. A little Bondo. And in Kenosha this time of year, it'd be great to have a convertible. But you have an expectation when you loan me your car about how I'm going to use that car. You want it back in the same color and the same general condition and things like that. The same is true of stewardship. It has a specific endpoint. It requires an accounting. And there are expectations associated with that. Now, in verse 3 and 4, we find that Jesus gives us an insight into the manager's thoughts, just like he does with the unjust judge or even the prodigal son. He tells us, here's what they're thinking, so that it makes sense what they are about to do. And he says, the manager said to himself, what shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg. So I know what I'll do. When I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. He's having a moment of realization, just like the prodigal son. He's saying, wait a minute, this isn't working out the way I expected it to. We had a good thing going. I was pretty happy with this, but now it's coming to an end. What am I going to do? And again, the question is, how do I get received? How will I be received? And Jesus is going to pick up on that theme. He's going to tell us at the end of this parable specifically what he wants us to do in order to be received. But we'll hold that for a minute. And then the steward has a plan, and let me just tell you that some parental guidance is recommended in this plan. You can't just take this lock, stock, and barrel. You can't have your kids quote this to you and say, this is what we should do. This is an example only. He says, he calls in the debtors. He asks, how much do you owe? Here is 800 gallons of olive oil, and this is big money. Okay, don't think of going to Woodman's in the olive oil aisle where you have all the different brands and things like that. This is commercial operation quantities of olive oil. So about 146 trees. This is worth about 1,000 denarii, which is about 5 years' wages for the average worker. So we're talking about $150,000 worth of olive oil that is owed to the master. The steward says, tell you what, let's cut that in half. Buddy, good friend, what are you doing for dinner this Saturday night? I'm free. So, again, 1,000 bushels of wheat. He calls him in. 1,000 bushels of wheat is actually worth more than that in that time frame. It's about 1,500 denarii, maybe 2,000 according to some commentators. And so we're talking about, it's almost 3,000 denarii, which would be about 15 years' wages. We're talking just under $500,000 in modern terms of wheat owed. And he says, tell you what, we're going to cut that down by about 75,000. The reduction is the same in both debts. So, and in fact, it's a pretty good year's wage. It's kind of like, I'll be your friend, we'll split it, and I'll be your friend for a year, and I'll be your friend for the next year, and by then I'll have a plan. And it's implied here that there were several debtors that he went through. So he was accused of squandering the master's possessions, and in fact we find, yes, that's exactly what he does. He lives out that expectation. Now the question that commentators get tied up on is this some sort of interest on a loan that he shouldn't have been charging in the first place? Is this his commission? Is he stealing this? And I think it's pretty clear that he has the prerogative to do this. The master doesn't accuse him of stealing at the end. He's accused of wasting. Okay? He was the man in charge of the house. If there were bad debts, it was his prerogative to write off bad debts. And in fact, he was in the last days of office doing what he wanted to do to make sure that he had provision for the future. So he was not stealing, as it was. He was recklessly using the possessions of someone else for his own benefit. Okay? He was recklessly using the possessions of someone else for his own benefit. That's what he was doing. And he's commended. The master commended the dishonest manager in verse 8 because he had acted shrewdly. Now, this is a very important word here, shrewdly. And this is where, again, commentators get tied up in knots. Now, was it the bad ethics and that the master has worse ethics and so he thought this was an okay thing to do? The key word here is shrewd, and it's a little bit hidden in the NIV because that's a common word. It's a common word that means wise or clever. There's only two places they choose to translate it as shrewd. That's here, and one other time when Jesus says, I'm sending you out as sheep among wolves. Be as innocent as doves and as shrewd as serpents. He says, be wise. I'm sending you out. Be clever. This is going to be hard. And in fact, the steward here, the dishonest steward, the dishonest manager, is being commended for finally acting like a manager. He wasn't really planning for the future when he was recklessly wasting stuff before, because he knew he'd be out of a job. Eventually it would be found. Now he says, okay, I'm out of a job, but what am I really going to do for my future? And he starts to make provision, okay? The things that we need to do as a steward or a manager is to be clever, to be wise, to make provision for the future. There's one other thing that Paul the Apostle says we should do as a steward. If you want to flip to that, it's 1 Corinthians. Keep your finger there in Luke 16. It's 1 Corinthians, the 4th chapter. And it's the first verse. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 1. Paul is writing to the Corinthian church, and he says, so then, men ought to regard us as servants of Christ and as those entrusted with the secret things of God. That's the same word. Those entrusted is the same word as steward here. And he says, now it is required that those who have been given a trust must prove faithful. That 7-word combination, those who have been given a trust, in Greek is one word. That's oikodomenos. He says, and that's the same as the manager of the household. If you have been given a trust, you must prove faithful. So there's two things. We have this manager who was shrewd but not faithful. And Paul says the thing you've got to be is faithful. Now go back to where you are in Luke 16. Flip over to Luke 12. And that's the end of our flipping, so bear with me. Luke 12, verse 41. Jesus is telling another parable to his disciples, and they didn't quite get it. In this parable after the parable, Peter asks, Lord, are you telling this to us or to everyone? He's saying, okay, help me out here. Are you telling this to everyone? The Lord answered, who then is the faithful and wise manager? There's our key words. The faithful manager, the wise manager. Jesus says, you got to be both of those, and now I'm about to tell you what that's like. Okay? Who is the faithful and wise manager who the master puts in charge of his servants to give them their food allowance at the proper time? Remember, we talked about that. If you have enough slaves, just getting them fed is sufficient. So you might have, what's that guy like who gets to put in charge of the food? Verse 45, it will be good for that servant whom the master finds doing so when he returns. It will be good for that servant. 44, I tell you the truth, he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. But suppose the servant says to himself, my master is taking a long time in coming, and then he begins to beat the men servants and the maid servants, and to eat and drink and get drunk, to recklessly use someone else's property for his own benefit. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the unbelievers. Now, he says in the one place, if you're watching and doing what you're supposed to, it will be good for you. If you are recklessly taking advantage of other things for your own benefit, well, cut in pieces and sign with, it sounds bad. I'm not sure what that means, but it sounds bad to me. Verse 47 says, that servant who knows his master's will and does not get ready or does not do what his master wants will be beaten with many blows. But the one who does not know and does things deserving punishment will be beaten with few blows. And let me just stop there. Some of you may be hatching this idea. Well, I'm going to go with the ignorance few blows plan. So I'm just going to check out of this sermon right now. In fact, I don't want to know much more than I know. I'm just going to go. Jesus' point here is not many blows or few blows. It's no blows. And I'm going to tell you not how you get the no blows plan or the commended servant plan. But the end of verse 48 is one of the scariest to me in the entire Bible. This frightens me whenever I read it. It says, from everyone who has been given much, much will be demanded. And from the one who has been entrusted with much, much more will be asked. That scares me. You know why that scares me. Because we are the ones that he's referring to here. We're the ones who are entrusted with the secret things of God, like the gospel. We're entrusted, we're Americans, Christians here. We're entrusted with wealth far beyond subsistence. The Wall Street Journal reports that if you were at the poverty line in the United States in the year 2000, you were equal to the average household in 1950. Okay, the poverty line in the United States was better than the average person 40 years ago. And in fact, if you're at the poverty line in the U.S., you are, among the wealthiest 1% of all people ever in all of history. There's no doubt who he's talking to. The average income of all of history is about $640 a year, about just under $2 a day. The average income per capita in the United States is over $20,000. So the comparison of who Jesus, who is looking through all of history when he's saying these things, it's very clear he's directed to this audience. Even you may be in poverty in the United States here today, and that's not a good thing, but he's still talking to you, much less all of us here. So Jesus is talking to us, and he says that if you've been given much, much will be demanded, and much more will be expected. So we really need to be clear here about what we're talking about. This parable is not really veiled at all. The master is God. The steward is us, the disciples of Jesus Christ. He's saying, and in fact, I think even the accusation is a good one. The accusation in Revelations chapter 12, verse 8, it talks about Satan as being the accuser who accuses us before God day and night, being thrown down. I am confident one of the accusations that he has said about me to God is that David Cotter wastes God's possessions. I'm confident one of the accusations of us is that we are squandering the resources that God has given to us. So we need to look very closely at Jesus' direction here to understand what he expects. Because this stuff has expectations attached to it, because this stewardship has a final endpoint to it, and that final endpoint will have a reckoning, an accounting that will be associated with that as well. The question at hand is, are we recklessly using the possessions of God for our own benefit? Jesus says in verse 9, if you go back to Luke 16, we'll stay there. In verse 9, he says, I tell you, and this is Jesus speaking, and it's emphatic when he says this, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourself, so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. This welcoming into eternal dwellings is this major theme, and who welcomes us but God himself? Okay, so this is talking to the sinners, to the Pharisees, and to the disciples. He says, you too will be welcomed if you do this thing. And this thing that you should do is, well, by the way, so that when it's gone, when this worldly wealth is gone, you should make friends for yourself. Make friends for yourself. We got to ask ourselves what that means. I think it's a little more broad than to just buy a round of drinks at the country club when you go, or have a block party so that everyone will know that you're a nice person, things like that. Make friends for yourself is something we want to look at. In fact, we'll come back to that. We want to talk about good stewardship in general. What does wise and faithful stewardship look like? And then we're going to apply that to making friends. Okay? Now, if you're taking notes this morning, there are 3 things that I'm going to suggest to you need for wise and faithful stewardship. The first is a financial plan. The second is a heart check plan. And the third thing is a investment plan. Let's just talk about the financial plan first of all. A financial plan is a budget. And Tom told me not to use that word, but I had to say it's a budget. It means that you would, let's call it a financial plan. A financial plan which says, here's how much money I expect to receive this year, this month, and here's how I plan on spending that money. Here's what I expect to get from God, and here's how I'm going to deploy those resources. It's a very practical thing. Non-Christians use budgets. I would commend you that if you are going to be a wise steward, you need to have a financial plan. In fact, it's good marriage advice. Instead of just arguing every week about money, you just save it all up and have one huge argument at the beginning of the year where all the numbers are much bigger, and you can say, wait a minute, it's one I get a Coke every day or something like that, or something out of the vending machine. It's only $1 or $2. But at the beginning of the year, your spouse can look at you and say, $1 a day? That's $750. You're going to spend $750 on Coke and candy from the vending machine? Are you crazy? My wife likes to stamp. Do we have anybody who stamps? Would you like to? We have a prayer team. My wife likes to stamp, and it doesn't seem bad $10 at a time, or even $20 at a time. But when you sit down at the beginning of the year and say, you want to spend how much money on cardstock and stamps and paper and all? It's good to do this. My wife showed me a stamp that she had. I don't know if you've seen these cards. It's a hand-stamped card, and then you personalize it on the back with a little stamp that says, hand-stamped by Anna, or, this card made for you by Melissa. There's a catalog stamp, a personalizing stamp that it says, I used to spend $60 twice a week on counseling for depression. Now I spend $100 a week on stamping supplies, and we don't spend $100 a week so we don't even spend $100 a month, but it looks like a big number at the beginning of the year. But we sit down every year and say, here's how much we expect to receive, here's how much we expect to pay in taxes, how much we expect to give, pay in taxes, housing, the kids, save for the future, and of the pitiful sum left over, we spend a lot on stamping supplies every year in the interest of marital harmony. So you need a financial plan at the end of the year, because I just can't see how you're going to get through Judgment Day without it, quite frankly. Some people, in my mind, and this is just Dave Cotter's contemplation, this is not from the Bible, but I always thought that Judgment Day would be kind of a quick thing. You'd get before the throne, there'd be millions of people in line behind you. You wouldn't want to take a lot of time with God, and you just, this way, that way, you. So we're trying to get through this all in one day. This is going to be a quick affair, okay? And with respect to being justified, with respect to being saved, God knows already. He's got that down. That's not the question. For us, the question is one of these, a reckoning of stewardship, okay? A reckoning of how the next world, the reward of the next world is going to come from what we have done in this world. And I think Judgment Day it's going to be more like an IRS audit, okay? This is Dave Cotter thinking. It's like an IRS audit, because for God, 1,000 years is like a day, and one day is like 1,000 years, and I can just see him kind of rolling up his sleeves and say, I have all the time in the world to go through this with you. Let's just start with that first $1, and then the next. And you may say, well, I don't have any records, God. Can I just, God, I have your records. I know exactly where they all went. Let's talk about every dollar you have ever gotten in your entire life and what you've done with it. And we're talking big money. I mean, in this room alone, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. You're saying, wait a minute, who's that? I'm talking, $30,000 a year from the time you're 20 to the time you're 60 is $1.2 million. Okay? So everybody, pretty much, who has a job over a sustained period of time, we're talking $1 million. And God wants to talk to you about that, and where it is, and why it got there, and what you did with this. There's, to stewardship, a day of reckoning that will be required. And I suggest that a financial plan in advance is going to be very helpful. Now, that may be very scary to you in a very practical sense. You may never have done that before. Or you may have done that and know that it is harder than you think. And that is exactly why at Crossway we have a workshop designed to help people do what the Bible asks them to do, help people to do what God asks them. On May 19th, 9 to 11:30 in the morning, you will learn all about how to make a financial plan, if that is a scary thing to you. You need a financial plan if you're going to be a wise and faithful steward. But you also need a heart check plan. And this is not Heart Check America. This is not an HMO. It's a recognition that there is more to money than just money. Okay? I always liked economics. And economics is called the dismal silence, so I'm at risk of being a dismal person, but this is a $20 bill. And economics tells us that this $20 bill is really nothing more than just a means of transactions. This is the way you make exchanges take place, rather than bartering 1 cow for 10 chickens or 10 shirts for 1 Crossway CD, those kinds of things. It's just a means of transaction. You get paid here, and you can carry it with you. It's a transport of wealth, and it's a store of wealth. But in itself, it is nothing and of no value unless you want to wrap your chewing gum up in it, or if you want to start a fire. It has no value except in exchange. It's no value except as a medium of exchange. So when we talk about stewardship and think about money that way, it's not money that we need to manage per se, because the $20 bill goes right where I give it. Or when I write out the check, I write the name of the person who I want the check to go to, and it always goes. The credit card goes where I put it. It's not a matter of managing money. It's a matter of managing your heart and your desires. It's our heart that we need to learn to manage. That's where we find pride. That's where we find covetousness. That's where we find greed. We find self-sufficiency. It's all in our heart. And if I were to give you $1 million this morning, I'm confident that it would not corrupt you. It would only enable you to do the things your heart wanted to do anyway. Money doesn't corrupt us. Our hearts are plenty corrupt. It allows us to express that. And it's the grace of God to many of us that we don't have more money so that we can express all the things we would do with money, particularly being self-sufficient and not relying on God and other things like that. And in fact, we have to look back up and look at money itself and not just talk about money as a means of transaction, but where does money come from? Where does it come from? For many of us, unless you've inherited it or you won the lotto or something like that, for many of us, we just earn it. We go to our job, we work, and we get our paycheck. And let's just break that transaction down from an economic viewpoint. Your company has a price that they put on you, a price that they are willing to pay for your effort, your time, your skill set, and how scarce your skill set is relative to the local environment. Your time, your effort, your skill set, and scarcity. That's sort of a shorthand way of describing your life. That's the price they put on your life in their employment. And when you show up on Monday morning, they say, I will give you this money for this much of your life. You may think that's a good deal, and if you go to work tomorrow morning, implicitly that's what you're doing. But do you really want this $20 bill? No, it's not of any value. What you want is to exchange this for stuff. Okay? You want to exchange it for stuff. So let's just take the money out of the transaction. You go to work to get stuff. You sell your life for stuff. Now God gives you your life, so He is very, very interested in the stuff that you trade it for. Okay? That's the essence of stewardship, and that's why God talks about money a lot. That's why Jesus, when He was in the temple, sat down. We pass the plates here, and we have a little disclaimer and things like that, and that's the appropriate thing to do. Jesus, when He went to the temple, He sat right in front of the collection. In fact, He watched people and made sure He saw how much they put in. And in fact, when the widow came, He called His disciples over. Hey, look at this. We're going to talk about money right now. We're going to talk about how people are spending their money, what they're trading their lives for. I'm very interested in that, Jesus said. I think that's very important. So not only do we need a financial plan, we need a heart check plan. We need to spend even the money we spend on good things with other people in mind. And there's ways you can buy, two women can buy the same dress. One can be sinful, and the other can be pleasing to God. One might be pleasing to God because they just recognize this is God's provision. My husband works. I work. This is God's provision for me to have clothes, and I'm grateful for that. The other might say, I'll go with this, but this is not what I really want. I'm not content with this. I want something more. Or it might be a very nice dress, and it might be what other people will think of me. Now people will think that I have arrived because this is the same. It's not the objects we're talking about. It's not the things. It's our heart. And money just reveals what's in our heart. And that's exactly what God is interested in knowing about. But finally, we need an investment plan. We've got to be able to use this money wisely. God is giving us money for a specific purpose, and He encourages us to make friends with it. And I can't divorce that from the concept of evangelism, because the best thing I have to give somebody is not just my friendship and not just hanging around with me and not inviting them to my party, but the gospel itself. And so we need to be consciously thinking about how we're using our money and our time and our talent and our skill set for evangelism of people. And I'll dwell instead of on evangelism, because we have a whole course on purposeful lifestyle evangelism, how we write checks for mission work, because there it's a direct connection. You can fund somebody's ability to go to a foreign land or this land and share the gospel. And I think that you will be welcomed into heaven for doing things like that. God will be pleased with that. But even here, we can use our houses for hospitality. We can give money to the poor. We can raise our children. We can spend everything that we spend thinking about other people instead of ourselves. We need to have an investment plan that's looking outward. It's kind of like we need a wartime mentality. It's kind of like in war when you say, this is not how I really would spend my money if I was unconstrained, but this is how I'm going to do it in light of these other circumstances. I'm not enjoying myself as much as I'd like to. I'm not doing all the things I would like to. But there will be a day when this war is over, and then I get to enjoy the benefits of it. There is a very thin veil between this world and the next, and how we're spending our money here influences that. In fact, Robert Stein says, the irony of greed lies in the fact that the more people accumulate for themselves in this life, the less they truly possess in property of their own. That's the irony of greed in this life, of looking with too short of a vision, too short of a horizon in our investment plan. And if this sounds like we're talking kind of tediously about every dollar and every little thing that we spend, and I'm afraid that's what he's talking about. Jesus talks in Matthew 12:36 that every idle word will be judged. And if he's going to have time on the day of judgment to go through the idle words, I think he has time to go through all the rest as well. And so that's an important thing for us to think about. And let me just give you a disclaimer here before we go on. Let me just give you a disclaimer that this is not about Crossway. We're not behind in our budget, and therefore we roll this sermon out so that maybe people will give more to Crossway, or we're hoping for a building. This is not about Crossway. This is the 16th chapter. Crossway is about preaching the whole counsel of God. And beyond just being faithful on our parts of the text, we want you to experience true riches. We want you to experience the reward and the life that's inherent in doing the things that God asks. So if you're a visitor this morning, I just want to give you that disclaimer about what really is motivating this as a sermon. And in fact, now that I've given you the disclaimer, let me just be very clear that this is a test. This is my $20 bill. This is a test. God is going to wonder what is in my heart that I'm going to do with this $20 bill. The money that you have, no matter how much or how little, is a test. Look here at the next verse here in our text. Verse 10, Jesus says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. Do you catch that? There's some adjectives in there. There's some extra prepositional phrases. He says, if you can be trusted, you can be trusted. If you're trustworthy, you are. There's not a matter of whether it's a big amount or a little amount or whatever. He says, if you can be trusted, you can be trusted. Verse 11, so if you haven't been trustworthy in handling worldly wealth, who will trust you with true riches? He said, this is the test. Here's your $20 bill, here's your $100 bill, here's your $1,000, here's your whole salary for the year. This is a test to see what the priorities of your heart really are. And if you have not been trustworthy with someone else's property, who will give you property of your own? There's a very thin veil, he's saying, between this life and the next. And the choices that we are making here are influencing what will happen in the next life. Verse 12, no servant can serve two masters. Either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. My 20 here isn't really anything. It's just a means of transaction that expresses my heart. So I understand Jesus to say, you cannot serve both God and money. You can't serve both God and the desires of your own sinful heart. when you are presented with a limited amount of money, you're going to have to choose one or the other. And that choice is going to be observed, and that choice is going to have consequences with every dollar that we spend, with every moment of our lives, with all the talents and the skill sets that God has given to us. And let me give you just a final word of encouragement, and that is to not have the reaction of the Pharisees. The Pharisees who've been listening ever since 4 parables ago, they were muttering about Jesus receiving sinners and eating with them then. Now they sneer as if this is the silliest thing they have ever heard. And if you've never heard something in church like this before, or this scope, or you are surprised, don't have this reaction. This is their reaction. The Pharisees, who loved money, heard all of this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them, "You are the ones who justify yourselves in the eyes of men, but God," this scares me, "God knows your hearts." God knows your hearts. And what is highly valued among men is detestable in God's sight. So let's sum this up. We are stewards, and Jesus has a parable to us. He says it is not okay to squander your stewardship expecting to get welcomed in and just saved under the wire, as it were. Don't envy the prodigal son. In fact, there is a reward and there is value to continued, diligent, disciplined stewardship for all of our lives. Okay? If you can be trusted with little things, you'll be trusted with even greater things in the life to come, and in this life as well. Entrusted even with the gospel of Jesus Christ itself. So, my encouragement for you is to not be overwhelmed. If you need a financial plan, talk to Tom Worth. He's there. He's delighted to serve you. Take this seriously. Take this as a matter of prayer. Take this as something you could talk to with your spouse or your care group leader if you're single and say, "I've been seduced by sex. Can we talk about that?" Somehow that's easier to say than say, "I've been seduced by money. I think I've sinned with my money. I'd like to talk about that." This is something that we can talk about now at Crossway. And I would encourage you to talk about that with your spouse, with your care group leader, and with God directly. And I'll see you on the day of accounting. Let's pray.